The descriptions I gave in the previous lessons on the role of type and instinct in sex gave a description in the average levels of development, in the immature states, so in fear and enjoyment. So, although half of this course has focused on sex in these levels, there are some more things that I would like to tell you. In enjoyment and even more so in fear, people identify more and more with their passion, and the need for ego gratification gets stronger. And more they use sex for this person as they give more and more meaning to sex. People get more and more compulsive in wanting to meet their needs, and they may react emotionally when these needs are not met. And as a result, also the likelihood for non monogamic desires may become quite pronounced. So people in fear and interest are less and less in touch with their partner. They get more egocentric, more controlling, less vulnerable, and so on. So all of this also translates into a different sexual act than that in the mature states. Whereas the difference between types and instincts are just a matter of nuances in the mature states, these differences can often lead to opposite scenarios or characteristics in the immature states, especially in the ego state of fear. So as a result, it's more difficult to give a description of the immature sexual act that applies to all. However, let me try. For some people, foreplay may be similar to that of the healthy sexual experience, but for some people, they may want to shortcut foreplay. Others may need excessive foreplay to get aroused because of sexual repression. Yet others may find the foreplay more important than the sexual act itself, and so on. And there may also be some issues with lubrications or achieving an erection. But these are not to the extent that they spoil the sexual encounter completely. During the sexual act, a person may get overly active or, on the contrary, overly passive. And this leads to an imbalance and may damage even the arousal of the partner. It's also quite common for people not to be present in the moment and not be in true physical and emotional contact with the partner. But instead they may think of what is happening around them, what they forgot to do or what they need to do tomorrow, how they are perceived by the partner, and so on. And all of this reduces the quality of the sexual experience. And as a result, some people may try to compensate this limited excitement through fantasizing. A very important element in these immature levels are the challenges with surrendering and giving up control. For example, many people, but not all, may not go through the stage of involuntary movements and contractions. So all movements remain conscious and controlled. Typically, they're focused on the friction of the genitals instead of expanding to movements of the entire body. Another thing is that voicing words of endearment may add to the arousal and may happen in the healthy ranges of development, but talking or laughing during the sexual act is yet another manifestation of the inability to let go and the attempt to remain in control. Also, due to the lack of vulnerability and inability to let go, some people may have more difficulty in achieving orgasm. And this is especially true in cases of repressed sexual instinct or repressed sexual values. And of course, it may take longer for women than for men to achieve orgasm. But whereas the orgasm in the mature states is the result of surrendering to the sexual act, in the immature states, some people will rely on intense physical friction and tension. And of course, people with a strong sexual instinct tend to have less problems with the surrendering, and they may not need that much friction. And here I feel I need to make an important point, because many people with a dominant sexual instinct have little problems in giving up control and to surrender to the experience. So their sexual act may very much resemble that of people in the mature states, and they may not face any of these challenges about involuntary movements or achieving orgasm and so on. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they are mature. Being mature also requires being in real contact with the partner and not idealizing connection. It also requires that sex is not a compulsion, that there is no ego gratification, that the sexual act is a conscious act, and so on. So for people with dominant sexual instinct, it's very easy to fool themselves about their ego state. Another very important issue in the immature states is the impact of sexual repression, which is even stronger in fear than in enjoyment. The person is subject to a compulsive morality, so moral values to sexuality that are dictated by a religion or societal norms. And as we already discussed in the first lesson, in sex-negative societies, this may include the view that one is guilty of sinful behavior when having sex, or that sex is a shameful activity. And on the contrary, in sex-positive societies, it may imply that anything is allowed and normal. In the case of sex-negative values, this most often leads to a suppression of the individual sexual impulses. So a person may not be able to relax in sex or perceive sex as a pleasurable activity, and they may end up repressing their own sexual needs and desires. Now, this does not mean that there are no sexual needs. On the contrary, the needs are there, but they are pushed into the unconscious and they re-manifest themselves through dreams, sexually neurotic behavior, perversion, and so on. And it's also not uncommon for sexually repressed people to have a sense of superiority for their alleged sexual needs, for the lack of sexual needs, I mean. And it's also not uncommon that they allow the partner to have sex with them, but they don't allow themselves to get aroused. And it may also happen that they even refuse sex to the partner. So in reality, they're not free from sexual desires, and they definitely do not have any psycho-spiritual superiority. But instead of having the freedom to choose whether or not to act on the sexual urges, they just repress it. So instead of being conscious spiritual beings, they're just unwilling to accept themselves, and they refuse to be self-aware of what motivates their behavior. So they may have way less sex than what they may actually desire subconsciously. And logically, this will lead to sexual dissatisfaction of both partners, and it may lead to non-monogamous desires. And interestingly, these non-monogamous desires may not only occur with the partner, but also all too often subconsciously in the sexually repressed person, him or herself. Now, you may think that people with sex-positive values don't suffer from any problems. But that's not true at all. It's just that their challenges are very different. People with sex-positive values may overvalue sex to the extent that they end up undervaluing it, or put too much emphasis on it, or be preoccupied with, or use it as a consumption good, or be too uninhibited. And this may also lead to non-monogamous desires or to compulsively trying to meet their needs, which I will describe in a bit. Basically, whereas people with sex-negative values may have less sex than what their needs and desires are, people with sex-positive values may also often have more sex than what is good for them. And again, it's not that one is better than the other. Both are equally neurotic, but they're just expressed in a different way. And as a matter of fact, few people are truly sex positive. Even if you have liberal views, these are some kind of counter-reaction to the sex negative values that are at the basis of our contemporary Western civilization. Instead of suppressing the sexual need, most sex positive values that we have are just a way to rebel against the sex negative values. Yet the repression is still there, and we are taught as small kids to disconnect from our pelvis. So the result is that many, again not all, but that many people who have not achieved the ego state of interest or above are reducing or cutting off the sensations in their pelvis and inhibiting the orgastic reflex. Very concretely, during sex, it is not the pelvis itself that moves, but the abdomen, pelvis, and upper thigh as one unit. the pelvis is not free. So often, women may lie motionless or make forced and controlled movements of the trunk and pelvis. And men are likely to make hurried and abrupt movements of the entire lower part of the body, and often with tense muscles in the buttocks. Both contract the muscles of the pelvis. The pelvis is not free. Further, many are moving the abdomen and chest forward and pull the pelvis and shoulders back. And this is the opposite of the orgasm reflex, which actually requires the pelvis to move forward. And on top of that, instead of relaxing their muscles, many try to stay in control by contracting and tightening their mouth and vagina, which makes orgasm very difficult. So what's the difference between the ego states of fear and enjoyment, as they seem to be quite similar at first? Well, first of all, there's a huge difference in terms of self-awareness, which leads to different reactions when sexual needs are not met and when one is sexually not satisfied. In this state, the ego state of fear, we're not aware of how we seek ego gratification through sex. We do not see how we are messing things up ourselves. We do not see we are running after the wrong things. We're not aware of our own inhibitions. We are not aware of our sexual repression or how we rebel against it. Instead, we are self-righteous and convinced that the suffering is entirely due to our partner. If only my partner would make love differently. If only he or she would ask for less sex. If only he or she would want more sex. If only he or she would spend more time on foreplay. If only he or she would tend more to my needs. The crucial element here is really that we do not see our own contribution to the problem, and that we are not bringing any positive change ourselves. So this is very much a childlike attitude. In the level of enjoyment, we no longer suffer as much from these challenges. We start to let go, we loosen up, we try to control less, we are able to be a bit vulnerable already. But more importantly, we already have a certain self-awareness, but we may not act enough yet. We understand that the problem is not as much with our partner, but mainly in our own approach. We try to tackle some of these challenges, but very often we see how we could sort out some of the issues, but we may be too lazy or lack motivation to really do anything about it. We also start having more understanding for our partner because we start to build an emotional relationship. So very important is that in the level of enjoyment, we start to see how we are overdoing things. So people with a strong self-preservation instinct are aware that they may be too much seeking pure physiological release. People with a strong sexual instinct are aware that they may be too much seeking intensity, and those who are obsessed with tantric sex start to see that they may be overdoing it. And people with a strong social instinct are aware they may be focusing too much on how they use sex as a tool to maintain the relationship going. In enjoyment, we also start becoming aware of the negative impact of our character structure, which is conditioned by the passion of our type. And again, some even without knowing their types may understand it. So 8s may understand that they show up with too much big energy and lust. 2s may understand they use sex as a tool to seek love. 6s may understand their fears are killing the libido of the partner. So in enjoyment, we are no longer childlike, but more like an adolescent who is using his or her cognitive abilities to understand oneself and take life in his or her own hands. But it's not always working out yet. Secondly, the need for ego gratification and the need for sex are bigger in fear than in enjoyment. In enjoyment, we are actually aware that we seek sex more than needed or repress more than needed, but we haven't really found a mature way of dealing with it. Yet, when we give it due attention, we actually can control ourselves, but it doesn't come easily. We may feel an urge to masturbate, and we understand this is just a habit or a ritual to fall asleep. And we may even have an urge to seek out sexual adventure outside of marriage. And we're aware of all these dynamics, and we're able to take conscious action if we really, really want it. But often we just follow our urges and inner drives because we just enjoy it. So cheating is not uncommon in fear or enjoyment. In fear, the person will have a type-specific logic to justify why cheating is okay and will actually believe his or her own lie. But in enjoyment, the person will still justify it, but actually know this is a lie. Still, the desire for the transgression may be stronger than oneself. In fear, we're not aware of many of these dynamics, and we consider this normal, and we believe that everyone else experiences sex exactly the same way. And we're not able to control ourselves, except for neurotic control that some types may have. So in the level of fear, there's often a certain compulsive approach to sex, which is more softened and less pronounced in enjoyment. In fear, sex is used as some kind of consumption good. For some people, and especially those with sex-negative values, this may lead to pseudo-asceticism. It's pseudo-asceticism because it's a compulsive asceticism and not a conscious decision by someone who is able to experience sex and sexuality in a healthy manner. This suppression of the sexual needs may be seen as controlling or mastering their needs, but it isn't. It's just a fear to be confronted with feelings of shame and guilt. So some may actually refuse sex to their partner. Others may allow the partner to use their body for sexual gratification, but most often out of a fear of abandonment. And for other people, mainly those with sex-positive values, this compulsive behavior may lead to behavior of obsessive masturbation, fearing the relationship will end if there is no daily sex, obsessively watching porn, seeking multiple partners, and so on. Not fulfilling the need in fear leads to a sense of suffering. In enjoyment, it's more of a missed chance or a missed opportunity for some extra dopamine and serotonin, which would just improve the mood a little bit. Still, in enjoyment, the person is still able to function normally in society, even if the need is not immediately met. And also in fear, we still function more or less okay. So therefore, we're only talking about the compulsion and not yet about sex addiction. Sex addiction is a disorder whereby a person gives in to the urge to use sex to fill in an inner emptiness, despite the substantial harm and other negative consequences. But I will speak a bit more about sex addiction in the next video. A third important differentiation between enjoyment and fear is that we may see the first signals of possible sexual dysfunction in fear, but they're almost inexistent in enjoyment. And I already mentioned that there may be challenges with achieving or maintaining an erection, with lubrication, with achieving orgasm. Still in the ego state of fear, these are more of a discomfort that may happen from time to time, but they're not the norm. The use of medicines and aphrodisiacs may often deal with the discomfort or make the sexual act possible again, but they do not tackle the underlying reason for the problem. There's one final comment I wish to make here with regards to the ability or inability to achieve orgasm. Many people, and especially women, tend to believe that one's orgasm depends on the skillfulness of the partner, but that's not true. According to Wilhelm Reich, the only parameter that determines whether a woman can orgasm or not depends on whether or not she believes she can.